Hi, everyone. I'm Bruce Karasik, co-founder of the Jewish Republican Alliance and JRA Nation, talking to you from beautiful Southern California. Thank you for joining us today on another special edition of JRA Loudspeaker. Today's show is being brought to you by JRA Nation, the political advocacy arm of the Jewish Republican Alliance. You can now listen to JRA Loudspeaker on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or watch us on YouTube. We are happy to welcome back to our show a real expert on the Middle East, Michael Rubin from the Middle East Forum. Michael Rubin is the Director of Policy Analysis for the Middle East Forum. He is a senior fellow at the American Enterprise Institute, where he specializes in Middle Eastern countries, particularly in Iran and Turkey. His career includes time as a Pentagon official with field experience in Iran, Yemen, and Iraq, as well as engagements with the Taliban prior to 9/11. Michael has also contributed to military education, teaching the U.S. Navy and Marine units about regional conflicts and terrorism. His scholarly work includes several key publications, such as Dancing with the Devil and Eternal Iran. Michael earned his Ph.D. and M.A. in history and a B.S. in biology from Yale University. Michael, welcome.
Hey, thanks for having me, Bruce.
So much to talk about today. I want to start with Syria. In an email that the Middle East Forum put out on December 12th, and your emails are amazing that you guys put out, you raised some interesting questions about the recent overthrow of Syria, its effect on the entire Middle East. And so I wanted to kind of delve into that right away. So first of all, how did this happen?
Look, none of the experts predicted this, but that's par for the course. When you look at the foundational seismic events that have afflicted the Middle East, the Islamic Republic revolution in Iran, Iraq's invasion of Kuwait, the Arab Spring, the experts, the diplomats constantly fail to predict. But hindsight is 2020, and what now is apparent is that number one, Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, this Turkish-backed rebel group, had significant support, while at the same time, the conscripts who were manning the lines for Bashar al-Assad's regime simply no longer wanted to fight. Their standard of living had declined so great that they were either cannibalizing their equipment to feed their own families, or at the very minimum, they didn't want to take time off from work. And so rather than do battle, what we saw was the Turkish-backed group struck a series of deals, promising immunity, promising various things if these groups simply put down their arms, and that's what happened. At the same time, of course, Bashar al-Assad was hobbled both by Israel's great victories against Hezbollah, as well as Russia being so distracted by the war in Ukraine.
So that was a follow-up question I was going to ask. Do you think that is why Russia permitted this, is because they were too bogged down with Ukraine for now, that they just were okay with this because they have pretty much backed Assad all this time? My understanding is that.
Well, in reality, this is the second time it's actually happened. Something like this has happened, Bruce, because when you remember last year, when Azerbaijan took over Nagorno-Karabakh, I mean, traditionally, Armenia was closer to Russia, and yet Russia allowed this to happen. And so, certainly, we've seen the same pattern. I mean, in a way, Vladimir Putin, with his bet on Ukraine, looks like a gambler who keeps losing, but thinks that if he can only have one more hit of the slot machine, that somehow he's going to make it all back. And so, what we see is Vladimir Putin simply going deeper and deeper in the hole with his Ukraine folly, and Syria is one casualty of that.
That makes a lot of sense. And, with all his bold talking, it turns out he has limitations too, it sounds like.
You're absolutely right. I mean, one of the mistakes we make is always presuming that we focus on our own mistakes, which is understandable and healthy, but we assume that our adversaries don't make mistakes. And the fact of the matter is, the Islamic Republic of Iran makes huge mistakes. So does Vladimir Putin's Russia. So does Syrian President Bashar al-Assad. Too often over the last couple decades, one of the lessons we've learned, and frankly, Israel has showed us, is that we can't self-deter. We've got to stop assuming that our enemies are stronger than they are, because the worst thing we can do is actually snatch defeat from the jaws of victory. I mean, it's not very public, but the Biden administration was in Oman, in Muscat, Brett McGurk, according to regional diplomats, who's the National Security Council special Middle East sort of advisor, trying to have talks about rapprochement with Bashar al-Assad. Well, would that, in hindsight, have been wise, given how weak Bashar al-Assad really was?
That's a great point. And, Alan Dershowitz raised some interesting points this week on his podcast. And he came out and said, basically, if Israel would have listened to the Biden administration, who told them not to go into Gaza, don't go into Syria, don't take out any leaders. In fact, they threatened Israel in saying that they would not give them any more arms. His point was, if they listened to him, Sinwar would still be alive, Nasrallah would still be alive, Hamas and Hezbollah would not have been weakened, and maybe Syria, Assad would still be there.
I think you're absolutely right. Who was it? Was it Robert Gates who had talked about how Biden at every key pivotal moment got foreign policy wrong, made the wrong decision, voted against taking out Osama bin Laden, for example. We see the same thing now. And it's easy when you're a 40-something Jake Sullivan or his deputy John Feiner, never having served in the military, have been Rhodes Scholars, to believe that you know everything, to try to control the region with a 7,000-mile screwdriver. But the fact is, the Israelis know best, the Palestinians know better. I mean, because they are on the front lines, they have skin in the game, and therefore it's absolutely ridiculous to for people who don't have to live under Palestinian missiles, Hezbollah missiles, the Iranian threat of eradication, to say, I mean, to listen to what's happening in the White House, because frankly, in the White House, if they get it wrong, they can simply, like in Afghanistan with the withdrawal, they can simply go home, have it sucked down the memory hole, and try something different on another day. Israel doesn't have that luxury.
They don't. And they have a press here in the United States that is more like Pravda in Russia, where whatever the administration says, if they're a Democrat, they just go ahead and they just echo it. So after Assad fell, and I'm assuming Turkey and Russia spoke before this happened. I assume there was communication. But after Assad fell, now for what I've read, Israel has now gone in and beat the hell out of whatever was left of the Syrian military and their defense systems. Is that correct?
Well, I wouldn't say the Syrian military. It looks like Israel went in and took out some of the weaponry they were most concerned about, the chemical weaponry and so forth, because they didn't want it to fall into the hands of these jihadis. And today, of course, the United States has said, oh, we're lifting the bounty on Abu Muhammad al-Jawlani. We no longer consider him a terrorist with $10 million on his head. Well, it's all well and good to be reformed al-Qaeda, but reformed al-Qaeda too often means not a Democrat, but rather instead of beheading the Christian, you only throw them in prison. I mean, the fact of the matter is, you don't want to take the risk of any of these Assad weaponries, any of these Assad arsenals falling into the hands of the new Syrian regime. First of all, the new Syrian regime, despite what is put forward publicly, hasn't fully consolidated control over the country. It's not like Assad is still out there, he's gone, but you have other rebel groups, especially in southern Syria. And at best, you're going to continue to have a scramble. At worst, you're going to have a situation in which these rebel groups Jelani might whisper sweet nothings into our diplomats' ears, while at the same time, there's a game of good cop, bad cop going on, where some of the other more militant groups, expressively more militant groups, decide to pursue terrorism and have plausible deniability. That's the dynamic I'm afraid of. And frankly, we've also seen a dynamic in the past with Ayatollah Khomeini before he led the Islamic Revolution in Iran. He said to Western journalists, I have no interest in personal power. Well, how did that work out? Or Recep Tayyip Erdogan, who said basically, I've learned the mistakes in my past. I embrace secularism. This is a guy that described himself as the Imam of Istanbul. Are we really going to make the same mistake 3 times with the Syrian rebels? I hope not.
You raise such great points. I have talked about Jimmy Carter since he was president. And I thought his decision to undermine or not support the Shah was probably one of the worst decisions of any president in American history, because that ultimately, and tell me if you agree, led to Islamic extremism being more pervasive in the Middle East. It led to 9/11. It led to the hostages being taken. It led to all the terrorism around the world. I mean, it's almost like they unpacked a bomb that was there, but just by letting this guy take office.
It was tremendously naive on Carter's part. Look, weakness is not a brand that the United States should embrace. I would also say, as a historian, that wars in the Middle East aren't caused by oil and they're not caused by water. Fundamentally, they're caused by overconfidence. And when our enemies become overconfident, Americans die. That's the major problem which we've had. I mean, you probably know, and this was reported by the Los Angeles Times back around 1985, 1986. If you remember back in Lebanon, at a time when many Americans were being taken hostage by Hezbollah or by other Iranian-backed groups, some of them actually killed under torture. Well, there was one incident where a Russian diplomat was was taken hostage and killed, and 3 other employees of the Russian embassy were kidnapped. And the way the Russians responded was by finding the relative of the kidnapper and quite literally chopping that relative up and delivering him to the family members. And you know what? The Hezbollah released the other Russians and they never took another Russian hostage. I'm not saying this is what the United States should do, but have you ever asked yourself? I mean, the Islamic Republic, the slogan was neither East nor West, but Islamic Republic. It was initially just as much against the Soviet Union as it was the United States. But why is it that the Americans were always the victims to the hostage taking? It's because Hezbollah learned really, really quickly. You don't mess with the Russians because they're not simply going to respond by having a resolution of deplorance or putting you, to make an Animal House reference, on double secret probation.
That is an amazing story. I think President Trump did something similar, although not vicious, but he basically had in Afghanistan. He showed the leader of the Taliban a picture of his house and said, "You better not touch one hair on any Americans." And for 18 months, nobody was harmed, and that changed when Biden came in.
Look, I live in Montgomery County, Maryland, just outside Washington, D.C., and the fatality rate from automobile crashes in Montgomery County was far higher than the average death toll of Americans in Afghanistan over the last 5 years. A lot of people forget, before Biden pulled the carpet out from underneath our presence in Afghanistan, that we weren't spending any more money than we were in Japan and Korea with our presence, and yet we were keeping the forces of Islamism at bay. When we create a vacuum, it's seldom the forces of altruism which would fill it. Unfortunately, that's a lesson that many American administrations don't fully understand.
They don't, because the reporters in the mainstream media don't talk about it, and this administration doesn't talk about it. So where are we now? What position should the United States take with these rebels in Syria, and what should our position be?
Well, Bruce, first of all, generally speaking, we need to calibrate our policy to the way the world is rather than wishful thinking of who our enemies have become or the way things were in the past. Now, my biggest concern moving forward is that prior to Assad's fall, many people in Washington were afraid that once the United Nations decided in the international community to help rebuild Syria, because there was a belief the Syrian civil war was over and Assad would remain, that some of this money would be channeled through the Syrian government because that's what the United Nations does. What I worry about now with Jalani's diplomatic offensive, trying to gain legitimacy and so forth, trying to gain recognition, is if we recognize this leader of a former Al-Qaeda group as the recognized government of Syria, that the money is going to start to flow in. Now, if it only costs about $4,000 to organize and stage a suicide bombing, what's it going to be like if we start channeling $7 billion into Damascus, some of which is going to be siphoned off by Jalani, or if not Jalani, then by Erdogan, his chief patron. The other thing I think we need to keep an eye on is what's going on with the Kurds. Now, we all remember the Islamic State a decade ago, and it was the Kurds in Syria, the Kurdish Peshmerga in Syria, who helped us defeat them on the ground. But you remember that with the Islamic State, Bruce, there were a lot of people who came in from all over the world, French, German, Moroccan, all over. And sometimes they got married, they had children. And when the Islamic State was defeated by the Syrian Kurds and the Americans, people didn't know what to do. The French weren't going to take back their jihadis and so forth. Or if someone got married and had kids, who do they belong to? So there's a prison in northeastern Syria called Al-Hol, Al-Hol. And it's guarded by the Syrian Kurds. There's about 10,000, 15,000 jihadis in there. Well, now that Turks are starting to bomb the Kurds, what happens if you have this massive prison escape of 10,000, 15,000 jihadis? Number one, they could spread all over the Middle East. Number two, they could spread all over Europe, and then there's not a big, it's not going to be long before they come across our southern border. But also, even if Turkey were to change its direction and become responsible, Turkey's already showed a tremendous capacity to blackmail Europe with the flow of refugees. Think of how they're going to try to blackmail Europe if it comes to turning on and off the spigot of Islamic State terrorists crossing into the Schengen zone. That's what I worry about.
Well, that is a lot to worry about. Similar to what maybe some countries in Central America, South America, Mexico have done with some of their prisons. Trump is claiming they're just letting them all go and letting them come into the United States. So we have a lot of terrorists and criminals that have come in here.
Trump's not wrong, not on this.
So this is a dangerous situation. So what do we do? If you were sitting with Donald Trump in the Oval Office and he said, Michael Rubin, you're the expert, what do we do?
Number one, we support the drones. We support the Kurds openly. We support them with defensive weaponry, and we tell the Kurds, we tell the Turks, these are our allies. You are not to touch them. That's number one. Number two, with regard to, let's switch sides on Syria. So the Kurds are in the far northeast. The Mediterranean, of course, is in the northwest of Syria. So that area of the Mediterranean is where the Russian Navy base is. It's also where a lot of the Alawis, this offshoot minority sect from which Bashar al-Assad came. The Alawis, even though they have a lot of blood on their hands, they're scared to death of the reprisals which the Sunni Islamists who now run Syria might impose upon them. And they have reason to be, because it doesn't matter what someone says in Damascus. 600,000 people dead, think of all the blood feuds that represents. I mean, you're going to have reprisals. And if religious freedom is the canary in the coal mine, the fact that the Christians are already leaving Aleppo and Idlib, I mean, that's a sign these guys know Hayat Tahrir al-Sham. They know what they're like, and they're voting with their feet. So back to the Alawis in the Northwest. Why don't we tell the Alawis that we will give you some air support, some protection, a no-fly zone like we did with the Kurds back in 1991, so that you're not wholesale massacred. But in exchange, you've got to hand over that Russian Navy base to us. You know, there's actually, it may sound wild, but there's a precedent for this. If you guys remember during the Cold War, Ethiopia and Somalia switched sides in the late 1970s. Ethiopia later was at first an American ally, then it became a Soviet ally. Somalia was a Soviet ally, then it became an American ally. And the Soviets had built a base at a place called Berbera, which is basically right across from Yemen. And that base, the Soviets built it, but the Americans took possession of it. I mean, a dream come true for Donald Trump to gain a base without actually having to invest in one.
Is
So
Russia going
why
to let
don't,
that happen?
why, I mean, the Russians are already on their way out. That much is clear. And what's actually interesting is instead of getting on the charter flights and airlifting back to Moscow, a lot of the Russians are going AWOL from what I hear because they don't want to end up on the Ukrainian front. So they're trying to get to Lebanon or Cyprus and make their fortunes there. Rather, look, it was fairly nice for them to serve in Syria. Nice sunny weather, so forth. And they didn't have to be freezing to death and being blown to bits on the Ukraine front. Now that that's changed, all bets are lost. But you know what? I wouldn't want to rush into, as it appears the Biden administration is doing in its twilight, a recognition of this group that's running Syria, because that ultimately could channel money into their coffers, and that I don't think is healthy. I mean, Donald Trump is wise in wanting to not have the United States overextended, not have us everywhere. Where I differ a bit with Donald Trump is in his admiration for the Turkish strongman. I don't see Turkey as a force for stability. I see the Kurds as those who are most aligned with our values. I unfortunately see Turkey as to the 21st century in terms of the spread of political Islam, what Saudi Arabia was in the 20th century. We need to be very, very wary about where the Turks are going.
So do you foresee a war between the Kurds and the other group that just took over Syria, the militants?
I'm not even sure that the Syrian militants are going to be the ones who fight it. We see a Turkish military buildup right across the border. And the thing to understand about Syria and Kurdistan, a place where I've actually spent a lot of time, is that most of the towns and villages where the Kurds live are literally right up along the border. It's like the equivalent of Detroit, or at best Seattle, or Seattle. I mean, literally, I would be picking up the Turkish cell phone signal when I was in Syria in the Kurdish guest houses and so forth. It's that close. That's what we need to worry about. Because again, also, if the Turks go after the Kurds, where are the Kurds going to end up? I mean, they simply have no place else to go. And so I think Erdogan, as with many dictators, is playing with fire. He thinks he can achieve something. He's not thinking about the follow-on effects. And when you look at something like Istanbul, Istanbul is the largest Kurdish city on earth. Now, granted, it's a Turkish city, but you've got 3 to 4 million Kurds living there. I mean, the Turks can use drones inside Syria because most of the Kurds towns are small, it's fairly rural and so forth. But if the Kurds have to go to ground and if there's a backlash, could you actually have fighting erupt in the streets of Istanbul? That's not something which Recep Tayyip Erdogan wants to think about or will think about, but I can guarantee you the Kurds aren't going to go down without a fight.
So it sounds to me that what you have said was because of the war in Afghanistan, it actually backfired for the Russians because they're losing power now in the Middle East. So are they going to now then rally behind Turkey and to try to get to maintain their bases, to maintain their influence there?
Well, the Russians and the Turks have already, two things. First of all, the Russians and the Turks have, I mean, they may appear to shadowbox. But behind the scenes, Recep Tayyip Erdogan and Vladimir Putin understand each other's red lines. And we've been here again before with regard to Azerbaijan. With regard to Iran, we actually see a repeat of the Iranian strategy with the Taliban. And for those of you that look at the Middle East Forum Observer, our daily rapid reaction analysis on the Middle East Forum webpage, what you saw was a Persian speaker who analyzed the language coming out of the Iranian Foreign Ministry, where within a week, both the diplomats and the cryons on the television stopped talking about the Sunnis as terrorists and started talking about them as opposition and so forth. You have the Iranians talking about reaching out. Now, I don't think they're going to be all that successful, but they're going to try. And the Syrians, the big questions we have now with the Syrians is whether they are going to, in many ways, it parallels the debates we had with regard to Lebanese Hezbollah. Make no mistake, Hezbollah was always a proxy of Iran. But you had a lot of people in the CIA, a lot of diplomats, a lot of Arabists, a lot of academics say, no, Hezbollah has become a nationalist organization. They're no longer under the control of Iran. Well, the question is whether Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, now that they've taken over Syria, is truly going to be, whether it's going to remain a Turkish proxy or whether it's going to become a Syrian nationalist organization. But, they're not the only ones who get to decide. If Abu Muhammad al-Jawlani decides, let's say he's sincere, hypothetically, and he decides to say, I'm going to put Syria, I want Syria at peace with itself and its neighbors. I'm not going to do Turkey's dirty work. What's to stop Turkey from sponsoring another group to take him out? And I'm afraid of what Turkey especially is going to be doing in the region. Just because Turkey's a NATO member doesn't necessarily mean it's a force for good. And the other thing, which isn't in the news but deserves to be, is that in the coming year, Turkey's nuclear reactor is going to come online. It's Russian-built nuclear reactor. And not only is it built in a earthquake seismic zone, but are we sure that a Turkish nuclear weapon wouldn't be any more destabilizing or threatening than an Iranian nuclear weapon, especially with Turkey openly threatening to make war on Israel?
That is a scary, scary prospect. So let's talk. You mentioned Iran. Let's talk about Iran a little bit. So during the conflict, Israel has attacked Iran's defense system, let them know that, listen, we know where your nuclear sites are, but have not done anything to take those out. Several questions. One, how do you envision President Trump's policies toward Israel and the Middle East being different than Joe Biden's? I don't think the Biden administration was 100% supportive of Israel. I think Trump signals that he will be a lot more in support of Israel, but this seems to be a very complex situation with a lot of moving parts.
Well, let me put it this way. I think that the Biden administration actively sought to restrain Israel. And I wrote at the time, right after October 7th, that when Biden was talking about putting aircraft carriers in the Eastern Mediterranean, that wasn't to support Israel. That was to restrain Israel. Because it's not that the United States would have attacked Israel or anything like that. But if Israel was going to undertake any large-scale attack, it would want to do so with secrecy. And all it would take would be chatter from those ships to be picked up by Hezbollah and the Iranians, to be picked up by the Turks, and then the element of surprise is off. So, and again, when I used to teach for the Navy, and when I would talk to admirals or the chiefs of naval operations, to a man and a woman, what they would say is if the United States wanted the Iranians to take us seriously, the posture of the U.S. Navy should be to withdraw from the Persian Gulf. Now, that may seem counterintuitive, but think about it. Our ships are huge, and when they're in the Persian Gulf, they're susceptible to speedboats, mines, drones, also anti-ship missiles. But if we're parked 400 miles away in the northern Indian Ocean, we can strike at Iran. They can't strike at us. And that's something which the Iranians would pick up. Now, when it comes to Donald Trump, what I think is that he is going to simply get out of the Israelis' way. I don't think the Israelis have gone far enough, for reasons I can explain, in deterring Iran, especially after the last two missile and drone barrages. But Israel has shown that they can act with precision. They can respond with precision. Donald Trump is basically going to tell them, And this is his constant theme in Asia, in Europe, and so forth, that it's time for our regional partners to take their defense into their own hands. He's not going to stop Israel from doing that, and that's welcome. Frankly, I think because he won, the Israelis figure they have a little bit more time to plan more carefully. They were afraid of a Kamala Harris administration would be actively hostile to them as the crazy progressive fringe of the Democratic Party took power. The Israelis no longer have to worry about that.
Well, that's good in itself. But I think the last time when you were on with Greg and Daniel, I asked the question about taking out Iran's nuclear sites. And I sensed from the consensus that you all didn't think it was a good idea at the time. What do you say now?
Um, Number one, the problem is not Iran's nuclear weapons, it's the regime that would wield them. So, if it's a choice between the Islamic Republic having nuclear weapons or not having nuclear weapons, Israel's got to do what it takes militarily or otherwise to deny them nuclear weapons. But ultimately, that's kicking the can down the road. We can't take our focus off the main issue, which is the regime itself, and we shouldn't do anything to throw that regime a lifeline. Unfortunately, 2 days after President Trump beat Kamala Harris, the Biden administration released $10 billion, unfroze $10 billion worth of Iranian assets. That itself is simply, I mean, I view that frankly as treasonous.
An additional 10 billion, more
Yes,
than what he had released earlier, as you're saying.
yes. The Washington Free Beacon has reported on this. And I mean, it was basically buried in a lot of the other news coverage and so forth. But to me, it's scandalous that that anyone would fund our enemies.
Who made
And you
that
can say,
decision?
oh, it's what, Bruce?
Who made that decision in the Biden administration? It wasn't him.
Well, presumably it was Jake Sullivan. I mean, the problem is the Biden administration is a black box, as the Wall Street Journal has recently reported, that you had a few top advisors very undemocratically shield him so that his senility wouldn't become widely known. To me, that I mean, it was a creeping slow motion coup d'état because that's not the way the United States should work. I mean, the president should be elected, and we have mechanisms in place should the president be declared incompetent, but you don't have unconfirmed officials take the reins of power.
Basically, we were operating without a president who was just a rubber stamp for his advisors.
Yes. And that, I mean, that's very, very dangerous to democracy, which is why I find some of the, the, some of the polemics, some of the uh, commentary coming out of the Democrats and the Democratic-led press to be somewhat ironic because what we saw for the last 4 years was the antithesis of democracy.
And Kamala Harris had to know about this. She saw him every day.
Well, in theory, she saw him every day. I'm not quite sure that was the case. But, I mean, when broadly you're talking about just one broader point, Bruce, when we talk about Kamala Harris. First of all, my biggest fear about Kamala Harris was that she appeared and she projected herself to be so vacuous that she would have been tested by Putin and Xi on day one. And I was really afraid, not that Trump would cause a war, but that the sense of weakness, the sense that there's blood on the water, would lead very, very quickly to American deaths. That's number one. But number two, when we hear from the media about how popular Kamala Harris was, I mean, I don't just work in the Middle East. I do a lot of work in East Asia, and I also do a lot of work in Africa. I mean, for example, I spent the summer, part of the summer in Congo, embedded with some insurgent rebels in the Democratic Republic of Congo. And when I'm in and traveling across Central and East Africa, people were very much favorable to Donald Trump over Kamala Harris. And that may seem counterintuitive because, after all, Donald Trump said, "You're shitty little countries." But when you talk to them, they would say, kind of that's a little bit true. We don't like when other people say it. But because he had no interest in us, he deferred the management to the professionals who actually listened to us, as opposed to someone like Tony Blinken, who is only concerned with LGBTQ plus
Right,
diplomacy,
exactly.
which the Africans had no interest in. And when it comes to the Middle East, my friend Brian Katulis had written about this, and he's on the other side of the aisle. But when it comes to the understanding of Donald Trump, look, here's someone who has family members with sometimes ill-defined portfolios. He likes to surround himself with generals. And let's face it, some of his business interests perhaps cross conflict of interest lines. So what's the difference between him and an Emirati or him and a Jordanian or him and a Saudi? The fact of the matter is the leaders in the Middle East, especially the Arab leaders, believe that they understand Donald Trump. They can communicate with him, and that can be a net positive. When I'm in Eastern Europe, look, I used to work for Donald Rumsfeld, and he used to talk about old Europe and new Europe, and the Europeans hated it. But there was something to it. When it came to the favorability of Kamala Harris, it was, I would say, the knee-jerk racism of Western Europe, assuming that they should recognize that they should be representative of everyone. It was like the new colonial era. And it wasn't just the backlash in the United States, in the world, if anyone was listening, there was a tremendous backlash to this sort of arrogance, which we're hearing from the Democratic establishment here and in Western Europe.
Well, it's amazing. We were all blessed that the election went the way it did for the world and for America. So now I'm going to ask you a similar question. So you're sitting with Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, and you were here in the room together with his advisors, and he says, Michael, what should I do about Iran and Hezbollah and Hamas? What should I do?
Okay, number one, with regard to Hezbollah and Hamas, he already seems to have been doing it. I don't know that I could give him new advice. When it comes to what he should tell the United States, however, I'm afraid that the Trump administration is going to continue Biden's mistake and again snatch defeat from the jaws of victory. Iran's back is to the ring. I mean, they've been knocked out pretty much in Lebanon and in Syria. It's going to be very, very hard for them to supply the Houthis. They're going to double down. They're going to try to double down in Iraq. They're going to try to consolidate their position there. So why, when their back is to the ropes, would we withdraw from Iraq? I mean, basically, we are creating that vacuum to allow the Iranians to consolidate control. And this should be the absolute last time we should do it. We don't need to do more. We don't need to fight the Iranians in Iraq. But simply maintaining our presence there would give the Iraqis enough pause to understand that they can't simply be rolled over by the Iranians. So that would be my chief advice. I would also give advice through Netanyahu to the Americans. Enough with Qatar. Just because they give you an air base at Al Udeid, let's see the forest through the trees. You should never trust a negotiator, an intermediary. And this goes for the Qataris, this goes for the Turks, and sometimes it even goes for the Egyptians. Never use an intermediary who wants to see you defeated. That should be a cardinal rule of American diplomacy. And unfortunately, it's a rule that the Biden administration and too many people in the State Department don't seem to understand. But it's not just that the Qataris support Hamas or supported the Taliban, or that the Turks support Hamas. We have a problem with the Sultanate of Oman. They've been playing the Qatar role, but with regard to the Houthis in Yemen. And we've got to tell the Omanis enough. It's all well and good to use your good offices, but our goal is to see these guys defeated. And at this point, you're doing more harm than good. We've got to stop the United Nations from making the same mistake with the Houthis that they did with the Palestinians. I mean, when it comes to the United Nations, they are now actively paying Houthi salaries through the implementation of something called the Stockholm Agreement, which was supposed to ensure that the Houthis weren't able to siphon off humanitarian aid at the port of Hodeidah. Won't go into too much, but people can Google the Stockholm Agreement, I think of 2018, 2019. The fact of the matter is the UN is actively paying Houthi salaries. That needs to stop. I don't understand why it's considered so sophisticated to continue to shoot ourselves in the foot.
You raised some interesting points. So if the Iranians are very close to a nuclear weapon, how much time, one, do the Israelis have to take that out? That's question number one. And then two, you also mentioned that we have to think about ways to undermining that whole regime there. And can we be successful? And is that opening us up to, oh boy, we have to have a presence now in Iran, and Russians are not going to like us on their border, and it's a very complex situation. So how does Israel balance that?
Well, the second question, look, we can support the Iranians without, and there should be no circumstance should U.S. boots be on the ground. First of all, we need to recognize that we shouldn't do anything to preserve the Iranians. Why is it that the AFL-CIO, for example, will support labor everywhere in the world except in Iran? Why is it that the Green Movement in Europe and elsewhere will support environmentalism everywhere in the world except in Iran? The fact of the matter is, if we're willing to support strike funds for Iranian labor, if we're willing to support the environmentalists in Iran who take on the corrupt dam building activities and development schemes of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, that's a net positive. And so we should be thinking, we have an Israel Victory Project that Daniel Pipes runs at the Middle East Forum. We should be thinking about an Iran Victory Project, enabling the Iranian people to overthrow this regime. And we should do whatever we need to help support them, absent our own direct involvement, which is easy because the Iranians don't want us there in the first place. Could you just remind me of your first question again?
So we talked about two different options. One is taking out their nuclear weapons, and how much time do they really have? Because you can't unring that bell. Once they have it.
And that's what I was thinking about. One of the problems we have analytically, I'm afraid the Iranians are almost already there. And we don't have time because we define in the United States government an Iranian nuclear bomb as being 20 kilograms of 90% highly enriched uranium, because that's what we would do. But the Iranians, by some accounts, are already up to 80%. The bomb that was dropped on Hiroshima was 78% enriched uranium. And while the Israelis can celebrate, and while the Americans can celebrate, that in April, for example, 293 out of some 300 missiles and drones were shot down on their way to Israel, is that really a victory? If any of those 7 weapons that got through, missiles that got through, had biological, chemical, or radiological warheads. You don't need a fissile bomb to create chaos. If Iran explodes a dirty bomb in the heart of Tel Aviv, imagine the economic and psychological damage that that would do. So the fact of the matter is, I'm afraid, Israel doesn't have any more time. And so I suspect we're going to see action sooner much sooner rather than later. And I'm talking weeks rather than months or years.
So does President Trump make a deal with Putin and say, hey, listen, you want to get out of you want to get out of Ukraine. We want Israel's security. Make a deal that will support an agreement with the Ukrainians that gives up a little territory and buffer for them. But at the same time, they stay away and let Israel do what they need to do in Iran, as long as there's no threat to Russia?
Here's why I'm dubious of that, Bruce. It takes 2 to make a deal. And I honestly don't, I've heard a lot of different proposals coming from those around Trump and proxies for Trump and so forth, but I don't see Vladimir Putin negotiating in good faith. And therefore, I don't see a real deal coming through. It would be like, look, we can argue that maybe Trump was smart to reach out a trial balloon for negotiations with Rocket Man Kim Jong-un. But the good thing about Donald Trump, and this is where I would hope his wisdom would repeat, is it's one thing to reach out. It's another thing to realize your opponent isn't sincere and to cut your losses. Our problem within the culture of the State Department is they never want to take no for an answer. So if Donald Trump wants to float a deal, fine. But if Vladimir Putin, it's clear, isn't going to play ball, then Donald Trump should go rapidly in the other direction.
Which means what?
Which means letting Israel act unilaterally on its own, which means supporting Ukraine to the best of our ability, because I see both Ukraine and Israel as being on the front lines of the battle for the post-World War II liberal order, frankly, for the battle for Western civilization.
even if Russia is now, from our first part of our conversation, is in a very weakened state, don't they want to get out of Ukraine?
If you act, I mean, if you read, there's two things here. First of all, it's not clear that the Russians, when you're a dictator, you can be deluded by those around who aren't going to um, give you an honest assessment of what's going on, number one. Number two, you may believe that you're in it so deep that you can't politically survive if you show weakness by leaving. But number three, you've got a situation, if you look at what Vladimir Putin wrote in one of the Kremlin publications back in 2019, 2020, or his speeches on February 21st and February 24th, 2022, right before and as he went into Ukraine, he was denying the very legitimacy of Ukrainian existence. I'm afraid that it would be analogous. Russia negotiated, I mean, you pushing Ukraine into negotiations with Russia is like pushing Israel, in my opinion, into negotiations with Hamas. You're dealing with an ideological adversary that wants to see you eliminated from the face of the earth. There really is no compromise with that.
So how does anybody sleep at night in that region?
A lot of people aren't sleeping at night, Bruce. I mean, it's that
It
simple.
is scary.
Oh, yeah. No, I mean, we're in a really, really tough situation right now. And let me just put it this way. In these sorts of issues, there are no magic formulas. And those who believe that is a magic formula are fools.
So if the Israelis go in and they take out their nuclear weapons and their nuclear sites and set them back years, then they still have the issue with Turkey potentially having nuclear weapons to the north.
Put it this way, Bruce, we're at the end of the beginning. We're not at the beginning of the end. The fact of the matter, and what I hope we can do through this conversation is highlight the fact that Iran isn't the only danger. I mean, and this is, I mean, I guess in conclusion, almost, this is what frustrates me most. We tend to look at the situation as either or. We need to defeat Iranian Shiite extremism. And therefore, we're willing to turn a blind eye to the threat of the Turkish-sponsored Sunni extremism. In reality, it's of the chief interest of the United States, and I would say of Jerusalem as well, of Israel as well, that our goal should be to defeat all extremism. It doesn't matter whether it's the Sunni flavor or the Shia flavor, they both pose threats. We've got to learn as a nation how to walk and chew gum at the same time.
Well, I proposed questions based on you sitting in the room with President Trump and with Prime Minister Netanyahu. I hope they invite you to do exactly that, and members from the Middle East Forum to give your input, because the research and the knowledge and the expertise that you have is invaluable to Israel and to the United States and to our listeners, who I know have never heard any of this behind the scenes information, and how the interplay between all these countries are so complex.
Yeah, I mean, thank you. And I can say that the folks at the Middle East Forum, you have a number of people who are plugged into the right. I mean, we're nonpartisan, but you have a number of people who are plugged into the right positions. And I suspect that in the coming couple years, some of our ideas will come to fruition. And of course, we've seen the Israel Victory Project of Daniel Pipes. Why should we compromise with Palestinian terrorists? The way to peace is Israel's victory over the terrorists. Black and white issue. That's come into the mainstream now, and it's through the good work of the JRA, of the Middle East Forum, and elsewhere that these ideas can actually percolate to the top.
Well, Michael, thank you for your time, your expertise, and your willingness to answer all the tough questions and provide such detailed answers. So appreciated. Please send our best from the Jewish Republican Alliance to Daniel and to Greg and to you and to your entire organization. We wish you a happy Hanukkah, a Merry Christmas, and a Happy New Year. And hopefully we have a good 2025 coming up.
Thank you, Bruce.
Thank you so much, Michael. All the best. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for joining us today. This was an amazing conversation. Send this to your friends and to your family. Everyone needs to hear this interview. It was packed with essential information for you to know. Everybody can listen to our podcasts on Apple Podcast, on Spotify, or watch us on YouTube. Until we meet again, wishing everybody a happy Hanukkah, to our Christian brothers and sisters, a Merry Christmas, and a Happy New Year to everyone. Bye-bye for now.